another persistent matter receiving the attention of my government and others of the CARICOM region, and that is the illegal proliferation of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. In our attempts at addressing this problem, we have had to divert financial resources which we could have used otherwise for economic and social development. We have observed an increase in gang-related violence, homicides, illegal narcotics trade, and organized crime. The origin of the illicit trade in these weapons is beyond our national borders. It is of international dimension and therefore requires a global response.
At the United Nations General Assembly in late March 2013, Trinidad and Tobago was among 64 countries who agreed to a treaty which seeks to limit the international trade in conventional arms and to further prevent the illicit trade in such weapons. This has the effect of seeking to rid the streets of the proliferation of small arms, undoubtedly the most common means of the commission of crime, including murder, in many countries that include Trinidad and Tobago and others in the Caribbean. In her first appearance there as Prime Minister in September 2010, the Honorable Kamla Persad-Bissessar made this a significant point of focus during her speech at the UN General Assembly. Before that, and more powerfully since then, this country's diplomats at the UN have continued to play a significant role in getting the matter to where it was concluded with the establishment of this treaty. Folade Mutota is the coordinator of the non-government organization known as Women's Institute for Alternative Development. She's been an activist in this cause for much of the last decade as part of an international network. Good to have you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right. So let's talk about the process from then to now, and you could decide whenever then would have been.
Well, actually, the international campaign led by NGOs for regulating the global arms trade has been taking place since the 1990s. So that is actually closer to 2 decades than it is to 1. And that happened because NGOs, as you know, work on the ground, and therefore we get a sense of what precisely is happening, what impact arms and the flow of arms would be having on people's lives and the extent of the human suffering. And so consequently, people realize that it is one thing to deal with the demand side of things. By the time we get involved as NGOs in responding to what may be occurring in communities or in countries that are in conflict, we are really dealing with the end of the food chain, as it were, and we recognize that it was more important to also deal with the supply side and therefore look higher up the supply chain to see what interventions can be made at that level. And so that thrust for an instrument of some sort that would have common standards that all governments would be required to apply when trading in arms began. As a matter of fact, part of that civil society coalition was led by Oscar Arias, the former president of Costa Rica, who, as you know, is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate himself. And he mobilized a number of peace laureates to work on this issue of getting common standards that countries would be required to apply. So that the work really to get to where we are today, this Arms Trade Treaty, has been deep, it has been wide, and there's been a lot of collaboration. And I think that one of the things that we have identified as really central to the success that we've experienced is the collaborative efforts. I think even if when we talk about Trinidad and Tobago and CARICOM, collaboration is at the center of the success that we had at the negotiations. So that in terms of WINAD's involvement, we got involved in around 2003. And that was because we had been doing work in communities here, and we recognized that the proliferation of small arms in the communities were illicit, but the research was pointing to the fact that more than 90% of the illicit firearms that end up in communities, such as ours, globally, actually started out in the illicit market, in the legal market.
Trade.
And then you have the diversion, and then, of course, we have the impact here. And therefore, Bernard felt that whilst it is important for us to work in the way that we had been working, doing community projects, etc., that it is really important as well to get involved in ensuring that there is some sort of regulation of this trade so that we can reduce the level of diversion.
All right, I want to come a little later on as to how we find out what will be the impact of this treaty on the availability of these handguns in communities and in the hands of youngsters in whichever communities in Trinidad and Tobago. But before that, you say that really from what you're saying, I'm understanding that the treaty itself is an agreement among countries to establish and to agree on some common standards, is it? What are those standards?
Okay, so it's a legally binding instrument that says that all countries that are signed on to the treaty must regulate the trade in a particular way. Now, you have some countries that have very, very strong control systems, but then you have some countries that don't. And because you do not have standard procedures, you have loopholes. And therefore, unscrupulous people will, of course, exploit those loopholes. What the treaty is going to do is establish standard procedures for the transfer of arms. And it covers how countries trade, how you move arms between borders. It also covers transit and transshipment, which is important, for example, for CARICOM, because, as you know, we are not major players in the arms trade, in that we don't produce naturally, but also we don't buy huge amounts. The conventional arms trade is estimated to be $70 billion annually. And so we're not very involved in that. The weapons that are bought in this country and elsewhere in the region are largely for the law enforcement and the army and that sort of thing. But you will have from time to time weapons being passed through the country on their way to someplace else. And even when that occurs, there has to be a control system in place that says this is how the merchandise has to be handled. And that is going to be replicated here, there, and everywhere else. Now, the intention there is that if you have standardized processes that people uphold and implement, then you will reduce and perhaps at some point in time completely eliminate the diversion that occurs, that takes the weapons into the illegal market.
You know, there's so much to talk about this issue, because as you talk, I'm thinking about you know, a number of sort of outgrowths of this treaty. But let me ask you, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the work of His Honour Ambassador Eden Charles on this issue. He's been the lead man for Trinidad and Tobago at the UN on this thing, and I could tell you that I referred to the Prime Minister's address to the UN General Assembly in September 2010. Well, the night before she was to deliver this address, I was in a room with them and preparing that statement for her. And he, passionate is putting it mildly, about his disposition, about getting that in his speech and on the agenda at the General Assembly the next day. So he was absolutely overseas about the necessity for her to make a statement on that to drive the discussions further. And you would have been working with him for all these years on that.
I have, and I consider him a very efficient patriot. He's been excellent. He's been a good partner in this process. When we, as an NGO, began lobbying governments, so in 2006, we finally got some countries to agree to present a resolution at the United Nations calling for an arms trade treaty. So this is after the years of campaigning. We got to a point where governments had decided that they would sponsor a resolution calling for an arms trade treaty, which initiate really the process of getting a treaty within the UN system. And so I was doing my work. And so I approached Ambassador Charles. He was an ambassador at the time, actually. And what Bernard realized is that in order to get the work done in the way that it has to be, in order for us to be successful as a region, we needed to identify a champion government. And naturally, we are based in Trinidad and Tobago, and so we identified the government of Trinidad and Tobago as the champion government. And we made our approach to the government, and the government of Trinidad and Tobago up to today has never, faltered in terms of demonstrating a desire to see this treaty come into play. And you talked about the Prime Minister earlier and her first statement at the GA. And I just want to say that, like I said, we've worked over time with governments, but Prime Minister Persaud Bissessar ramped up the efforts to ensure that Trinidad and Tobago was pushing to have this treaty in place. Following the statement that she made at the GA, you would recall she also introduced a resolution on women, disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control, and so on, which found wide support within the UN among member states, and within the women's movement globally was hailed as a really progressive move. But also, she mandated the foreign affairs diplomats and the UN mission and so on to pursue getting this treaty under our belt. And I think that it is important when we look at the role that CARICOM played and the influence that CARICOM had in the room to identify what strong leadership can do. Because it was because of strong leadership and that dedication to ensuring that you put resources and time and the personnel and the political will behind getting this thing done. The government of Trinidad and Tobago hosted 2 regional meetings here in 2010 and in 2011. And those regional meetings really set the stage for having a cohesive and collective CARICOM going into the preparatory committee meetings so that governments from across the region were able to come to Port of Spain and agree what their negotiating position was going to be. And that template took us really to what we found, what we had on April 2nd, where we had a treaty, because CARICOM maintained a common position. CARICOM had one team, and Ambassador Charles led that team. And when you look at the influence that CARICOM had in the room in terms of member states listening for what the CARICOM position is, trying to collaborate with them, et cetera, I think it was a clear indication of what strong leadership can do, and therefore the government, and especially the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, needs to be saluted for the role that they've played. In terms of Eden Charles, he knows his stuff, as you know. He became very passionate about this issue, and it makes a difference. And I think that happens because we experience the pain. Practically everybody in this country knows someone or has a relative who has been affected. And therefore you bring that as well to your work, to the negotiations. But he's also a strategic thinker, so that he was able to keep that CARICOM team together throughout the negotiations. And I'm talking here about at least 3 years, because you had the preparatory committee meetings and then you had the negotiations. Now, anybody who has to manage a team knows that it is not easy to maintain and to manage a team over a sustained period of time.
And then
he was
with-
able to do that.
And then with the multiplicity of things on diplomats' agenda at the United Nations to stay focused on this.
Precisely, precisely. And every CARICOM country with a mission in New York, and they all have representation there, but they do not have the staff. So that people have multiple responsibilities, as you know. And therefore, to be able to keep everyone focused on that. And we went a little bit further as well. Huh? We not only worked with the diplomats in New York, we built these cross-functional, we built a cross-functional team with subcommittees so that, for example, we brought in people with expert knowledge in terms of customs, immigration, security of the region. CARICOM Impact was very involved. And so we brought together and of course, NGOs.
Yes. All right. Listen, I had a natural segue, but it shifted. But I want to bring it. I want to
Sure, go right ahead,
recall
yeah.
it. You talk about the fact that all of us in Trinidad and Tobago knows someone who
Yes.
has someone who has been a
Unfortunately.
victim of actions with the use of handguns. The question is then, how is this treaty going to address the depression of that? And you talked earlier about the fact that, well, maybe Trinidad and Tobago is one of those countries through which arms pass, but a lot of people's senses are Trinidad and Tobago is a country that requests, this is a destination for arms. And so how this treaty will seek to drive that down and drive it back and block it out.
Yeah. So it's two different markets we're looking at, because when we talk about the transit or the transshipment, that's the legal trade we're talking about. So that X country is trading with Y country, and in order to get there, they pass through here. So that you have all the documentation done, all the procedures followed, et cetera, et cetera.
As far as you know, that is a fact?
As far as I know, that is a fact, because as I said, on the team, the negotiating team, you had representatives from the various sectors, including customs. Now, one of the things that we know in terms of the illegal trade is that the firearms usually come with the drugs and so on, and we're a transit point, and et cetera, et cetera. The story we all know. But we have to look at globally how the diversion takes place. So that the arms start off as a legal transaction and are moving from X port to Y port. But in between there, the diversion can take place in different ways. You may have officials that are corrupt, and therefore they close their eyes, open their hands, whatever they do, and allow some sort of diversion to occur. You also have people who act as brokers and who may be licensed as brokers, but they also engage in illegal brokering, and therefore diversion occurs in that way as well. Sometimes, however, diversion will occur when the arms gets into a country, the country of destination, and you may not have sufficiently strong measures in place to conceal them or to protect them. Let's say the army doesn't protect, their cash in the proper way or so. Diversion can take place there as well. So in looking at the various areas in which it can occur, the treaty then seeks to close those loopholes. So they're saying, for example, if you're a broker, then you have to be licensed in the country that you're operating from. It can't be that you're operating here, there, and everywhere, and but where you're licensed is not one of the places that you're operating from. So it seeks to close those loopholes. Now, in terms of how it is going to impact our situation here, because we're going to be seeing, or we're supposed to have these loopholes closed, the expectation is that you will have a significant reduction in the diversion. So that's one way.
Is it your sense then, from the experts and from your experience on this thing, that a lot of the arms that end up on the streets in Trinidad and Tobago come here through the methods of the diversion?
It is diversion. It is diversion because, so for example, one of the things that the CARICOM negotiating position was to get small arms and light weapons and ammunition into the treaty. And that is because in order for the trade to occur, you have to use a set of criteria to determine whether country A should sell arms to country B. Inside that criteria, so that so inside that criteria, for example, you have gender-based violence as one of the criteria you should look at, because as you know, rape is used sort of as a weapon of war in some countries where women are violated by whoever is fighting.
They call it spoils of war.
Precisely. So you have a number of UN Security Council resolutions that deal specifically with how you protect women and so on. Yeah. So the criteria, one of the criteria would be gender-based violence. But inside the treaty as well, you have a set of arms that you know for a fact will be regulated. And therefore, those criteria would apply to those arms. For example, small arms and light weapons is inside there. So if our problem in Trinidad and Tobago is small arms and light weapons, then the country that is trading with us has to make sure that the loopholes are closed to prevent that diversion of small arms and light weapons into the illicit market. So that it's another layer of protection, because you know that there's a problem of the diversion and the illicit proliferation in the country. That is important for us because the more you look at it, the more you realize that whereas the arms were coming before with the drugs, now it seems to have its own market. So more and more guns are coming. And therefore, if more and more guns are coming and ammunition, it's really important for us to remember that ammunition go hand in hand with those firearms
with the arms,
you're talking about. Yeah. And therefore, if it is that you're finding that there's a larger market, a widening market for those guns and ammunition, then it is really important to put all the checks and balances in place to ensure that you minimize the diversion that has occurred.
Yeah. I want to use a paraphrase here. You know, people talk about speaking truth to power. I want to speak reality to power and ask whether or not, so this treaty will answer the questions of those people who ask, well, who is it who is bringing in the guns in Trinidad and Tobago, that will shine a light on them and therefore scare them away and send them into the darkness?
That's a tall order, Andy. That's a tall order. If you're going to affect systems and processes, then you're going to have impact. Because as we know, there's a network that is engaged in this movement of arms from one place to another. Because even when they're diverted and they're in the country and they have to move from one community to another, there's a network that facilitates that, yeah? And therefore, what you're doing is reducing access, because the availability of the weapons really make these weapons very attractive. If it is available, if it is there, I'm going after it, I can use it, I can purchase it, I can rent it, I can whatever. And so what something like this treaty is meant to do is to, like I said, plug the loopholes, plug the loopholes, plug the loopholes. Now that can only occur, let's get real as you say, if locally here we have the legislation in place, we put the administrative procedures in place to ensure that we can implement the treaty. The Prime Minister has said that Trinidad and Tobago is prepared to sign when the treaty opens for signature on June 3rd. I'm not sure how soon after that we'll be in the queue, but I think that it is, yet again, another demonstration of the leadership she has taken on this issue to signal that intent so early in the game. So we're hoping that that occurs. It also will signal to other CARICOM countries what needs to happen in their own territories. But then we also have to get down to the nitty-gritty, get the legislation going, get the administrative systems in place, put the resources together, whether it's human resources, the finances, et cetera, so that we can become compliant. And I think that Trinidad and Tobago is really well placed to really be a model of what treaty implementation can be.
Because this is not a case, as is usually said, that we are being put upon or forced on some of these international obligations. We champion this thing to a great extent to this point, so therefore we can't back down now with doing what is required to be done to make it live.
Well, yeah, I think that we've demonstrated, and I'm saying we as a country, we've demonstrated our political will, our commitment to this. We've demonstrated that we are prepared to take action. Like I said, we hosted 2 meetings in this country. And let me just take the opportunity as well to thank the government of Australia that's been very supportive in the process. And even at the last heads meeting in Haiti, the Prime Minister had it on her agenda again, spoke with the U.S. Attorney General about it and so on. So that I think that in terms of the political commitment, that is clear. But I think a lot of times what happens is that getting the administrative part of the implementation off the ground and working efficiently is where we stall. And as NGOs, we are prepared to ensure that that doesn't occur, so that it's something that we are going to be wrapping our heads around very, very early, and see what role we can play in that regard. But I think that you're right. We did champion this. Trinidad and Tobago had a lot of influence in the process as well. And I think we have an obligation, really, not only to ourselves, not only to our region, but for example, the African states, the Pacific states, those countries that are as affected as we are,
vulnerable
in a disproportionate way when you consider the role that we play in the trade globally and the effects of the trade on us. I mean, you know, chalk and cheese, and that can't be allowed to continue.
So this is an example of a success story of NGO government collaboration on the international scene in an area as critical as this.
I think it's a well, I guess I can use your term success story, but this success really for us is going to be in the implementation, because the implementation is going to determine the level to which we reduce the impact that illegal guns are having on our communities. So that for us, our work is really continuing. We are happy that we have come to a place where there is now a global treaty, a legally binding instrument that locks countries in and that says to them, this is the game that you have to play, and that's it, you know. We worked hard for that, we worked well for it, and we'll continue.
Well, good. Thank you very much, Folade Moto, the coordinator of the NGO Women's Institute for Alternative Development, an arms trade treaty that came about largely, or to a significant extent, on the involvement of that NGO and the government of Trinidad and Tobago at the United Nations in New York.